The Spanish killer who brutally murdered elderly women could have been released after just 20 years in prison. Is such a punishment fair for someone who forced his victims to swallow their dentures? But the fate of such beasts is not always decided by the law. In this video, I will tell you how the harsh realities of prison life catch up with those who escape deserved punishment. How exactly
Are serial killers dealt with behind bars? My name is Knox, and you're on the Crime Channel. Stay tuned to find out how cruel criminals get what they deserve, even when the law is too lenient.
20-year-old sailor Nikolai Radkovich went down in history as the first Russian serial killer, comparable in brutality to London's Jack the Ripper. In the early 20th century, Radkovich made the residents of St. Petersburg look over their shoulders and stay indoors in the evenings, instilling fear and panic in them. In July 1909, the body of a brutally murdered girl was found in the Neva River. She had over 10 stab wounds. Documents indicated that the girl was a prostitute, marking the first link in a chain of future crimes. Soon, 2 more women were found murdered in the same brutal manner. Their bodies were
Discovered in cheap hotels, and all signs pointed to the fact that these victims were also engaged in prostitution. On the last victim, investigators counted 30 stab wounds, indicating that the killer was becoming even more ruthless.
The police faced the urgent task of finding the criminal as quickly as possible to protect other women from being attacked. The press dubbed the maniac the St. Petersburg Jack the Ripper. He chose his victims from among those who sold their bodies, but unlike his London colleague, he never dismembered them. The police launched an active search, cross-checking hotel guest lists and ships docking in the port. They managed to track down Radkovich, who had stayed at one of the boarding houses several times. Radkovich skillfully misled the investigation, pretending to be mentally ill and claiming that he killed women to purify the world. He was responsible for the brutal murder of 3 people. His trial lasted 3 years, but in the end, he was sentenced to 8 years of hard labor. This was because the police could gather enough evidence to prove his involvement only in the last murder. He never regained his freedom. The killer, who was given the nickname St. Petersburg Jack the Ripper, died in a labor camp in 1916. According to one version, he was killed in a fight with criminals. Was Radkovich's death a deserved punishment? He called himself the Angel of Death. This quiet killer hid among those to whom people came for help. He killed
87 people, but justice caught up with him only 30 years after he was first caught. Donald Harvey was born on April 15,
1952. His childhood was marred by sexual abuse from his uncle, and at the age of 18, he was raped against his will by a roommate. He took care of his seriously ill grandfather. Every day, he visited him at the hospital, and soon he got a job there. 2 months after starting work, Donald killed his first patient. He simply smothered him with a pillow. At Marymount Hospital, Donald Harvey killed 15 people. And after he was fired, he continued his career as an avenging angel in other medical institutions.
The killer remained unsuspected for a whole 17 years. All that time, no one paid
attention to the quiet, modest nurse. Moreover, Donald's methods of killing were varied: suffocation, disconnecting life support systems, injecting air into veins, but most often he used cyanide. But his favorite method of murder helped catch the quiet killer. In April 1987, one of his patients, John Powell, mysteriously died. The pathologist noticed the smell of almonds during the autopsy, indicating the presence of cyanide. An investigation began. Police found glass jars of cyanide and arsenic, occult books, and a detailed diary of murders in Harvey's possession. Harvey claimed that by killing,
he was bringing relief to his victims, freeing them from suffering. That's why he called himself the
Angel of Death. There is some sense in this claim because Harvey committed most of his murders in hospitals, and his victims were severely ill people. When he was caught, he was sentenced to several life terms. He would have been eligible to apply for parole only in 2047 at the age of 95. But Donald Harvey died at 64. In March 2017, he was killed by a cellmate while serving his sentence at Toledo Prison. But could Donald's life have turned out differently if he had received help as a child? What do you think? It gets even scarier because his wife had no idea that she woke up every morning next to the town's maniac. In 1967, a serial killer began terrorizing a small town. causing fear among all the residents. Who would have thought that this
nightmare was perpetrated by a model family man, a father of 3? However, behind the outward calmness lurked a true monster, known as
the Gaffney Strangler. Leroy Martin was born on April 25, 1937, in Gaffney, South Carolina, USA. His life was progressing as usual, working at a factory, raising a family, and having 3 children. In May 1967, Martin began committing monstrous crimes, starting with the murder of 2 young women. These crimes marked the beginning of a series of killings that continued until February 1968. Victims disappeared one after another.
Martin seemed to remain elusive, continuing his bloody hunt. The police were baffled, and residents feared each new day. Amid these events,
an innocent man, Annie Lucille Dedman's husband, the first victim, was arrested. After the real villain was caught, he was released from custody. On February 15, 1968, Leroy Martin was finally arrested. He was brought to trial for the brutal murder of 2 women and 2 girls and was sentenced to 4 life terms. But he would never leave prison. On May 31, 1972, Martin was fatally injured by another inmate named Kenneth Ramsey. The sudden attack ended his life when he was 35 years old. Leroy justified his murderous tendencies with a split personality. One side was the good guy, and the other was the bad guy, and he claimed he could not resist it. But can split personality justify cruel crimes? What do you think? The Spanish police thought that elderly women were dying one after another due to senile dementia because dentures were found inside them, but it turned out to be quite different. In 1957,
in the Spanish city of Santander, a delightful baby named José Antonio Rodríguez Vega was born. The boy's family had a dark legacy. His
grandfather had killed his grandmother, and his father and brother were alcoholics. He grew up as a handsome, sweet boy. However, Vega's cruelty began to manifest at the age of 18 when he threw his sick father down the stairs. His mother kicked him out of the house, and Jose began to take revenge on her. From May 1987 to May 1988, Vega killed at least 19 women aged between 61 and 93.
He broke into the homes of lonely elderly women, beat them, and sexually assaulted them. And you won't believe it, but he made them swallow their dentures, after which they died. He would take souvenirs from the victims'
homes, which he kept in a separate room. In May 1988, Jose Vega was arrested and confessed to his crimes. He was tried and sentenced to 440 years in prison. But under the Spanish judicial system, this meant he could be released after 20 years. However, his fellow inmates did not allow that to happen. In 2002, he was stabbed to death in his prison cell. "Leave. This is our business. We'll deal with him ourselves," they told the guards who tried to intervene. Vega died from 113 stab wounds. Was it fair? Or would a life sentence have been a better punishment for Jose Vega? What do you think? He wanted to become the new Elvis, but ended his life in agony and solitude. Charles Schmidt grew up in a
foster family. In 1942, he was adopted by the childless couple Charles and Catherine Schmidt. His biological mother had abandoned Charles at birth
due to a head injury. Charles was short, about 63 inches tall, and this fact was painful for him. To appear taller, Charles stuffed newspapers into his shoes. And to be more attractive to girls, he stuck a small mole on his cheek. His short stature led to an inferiority complex. He avoided his peers, preferred to socialize with teenagers, and was very confident and a leader in their company. Charles began killing in 1964 at the age of 24. Over 2 years, his victims included 4 young girls aged 15 to 17. He tortured his victims, strangled them with a guitar string, and buried their dead bodies in the sand. In 1966, he was arrested and sentenced to death. Fate granted him a few more years when the state of Arizona commuted his death sentence to 50 years in prison. However, Schmidt was not content to simply sit and wait for the end. In 1972, he made a daring escape,
taking an entire family hostage. But a few days later, he was back behind bars. In March 1975, Schmidt fell victim to 2 inmates. Learning about his crimes, they decided to
expedite justice and inflicted 75 stab wounds on Schmidt. 10 days later, he died in the prison hospital. His mother refused to claim his body, fearing the grave would be desecrated. Was his death just? What do you think? Strange and horrific murders start happening in the city. 13 women are found dead in their homes, each with signs of sexual assault, and all of them have been strangled. The press quickly dubs this unknown monster the Boston Strangler. Panic grips the city, as no one knows who might be the next victim.
In 1967, the police arrest Albert DeSalvo for a series of sexual assaults. During interrogations,
He unexpectedly confesses to being the Boston Strangler. However, his confessions raise many questions. DeSalvo gets details wrong and makes mistakes in describing the crime scenes. Nevertheless, Albert DeSalvo is sentenced to life imprisonment. It gets even more interesting. Once in prison, DeSalvo starts acting strangely. He claims to hear voices and see his wife in the same cell with him. But the voices don't stop DeSalvo from dealing drugs at a reduced price, leading to conflicts with other inmates. On November 25, 1973, the conflict reaches its peak. DeSalvo is found dead in his cell with multiple stab wounds. It remains unclear whether DeSalvo was the real Boston Strangler, or if it was someone else. There is an opinion that the criminal didn't act alone. Debates about his guilt continue to this day, but the fact remains that the perpetrator of the deaths of 13 women confessed to the crimes and was punished. Do you think Albert DeSalvo was the real Boston Strangler and got what he deserved?
the actions of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer still chill the blood. There is even a series titled American Horror Story, with Evan Peters playing Dahmer. "I looked at people as objects," said the Milwaukee monster.
Jeffrey Dahmer. He killed 17 men, choosing those whose absence wouldn't be noticed immediately. Mostly they were drifters, hitchhikers, and petty criminals. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in May 1960 in Milwaukee. His father was deeply involved in chemistry. His mother was a very impressionable woman and reportedly took tranquilizers during her pregnancy. The boy grew up with little attention from his parents. No one noticed his strange behavioral traits in time. Instead of playing outside with peers, he preserved or dissected dead animals in formaldehyde. During his teenage years, Dahmer's parents divorced and he was sent to live with his grandmother. In her basement, he dismembered his first victim. When his grandmother kicked him out, he rented an apartment where he continued his killings. Dahmer committed 17 murders until 1991. His methods were horrifying. He drilled holes in the skulls of his sleeping victims, poured acid into them, and removed facial skin to create masks. All crimes, except one, were committed in Milwaukee, hence the nickname Milwaukee Cannibal.
On July 22, 1991, Dahmer was arrested. The court sentenced him to 15 life terms. In his final words,
Dahmer expressed deep remorse and requested death. Ultimately, this is what happened. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by inmate Christopher Scarver, who was serving time for robbery and murder. Dahmer's body showed no signs of resistance. A terrifying story, isn't it? Murderers are those who sow evil and cruelty in society. Many innocent people suffered at their hands, and they received life sentences for their crimes. They were to spend long years in confinement, reflecting on their actions, but their lives were cut short by those who shared the prison walls with them. Was this deserved retribution or another act of injustice? And you know how to write scripts, edit, or voice videos? Send a message to the Telegram bot via the link in the description. I'd love to collaborate.
this has been Knox. Like this video and see you next time.